Go ahead, hit it.
You're on.
Hi guys, my name is Mike Giancola and welcome to my defense, my portfolio presentation, which I have entitled The Long and Winding Road, my journey to becoming a teacher. I'm obviously a tremendous Beatles fan, and that was the perfect way to sum up how my whole, graduate school experience and education went. Well, if you all understand who I am as a teacher, I first kind of want to explain who I am as a person. Like Paul, I grew up in Centerville, Virginia and went to Westfield High School, graduated and came here to Tech to do my undergraduate as well. Ever since I can remember, I was a Hokie through and through. I wanted to go nowhere else but here. Of course, during the whole college process, my dad made me apply to other schools. So I applied to 3 others, got in, and of course Virginia Tech was the one that let me know last. So when I got that envelope and opened it up, very, very sheepishly I looked, heard I got accepted, looked around the block because I have a lot of small children around. There was no one around, so I screamed and yelled some obscenities, and it was wonderful. It was the best feeling of my entire life. So I knew I was going to go here. I didn't even come and visit. The first time I was here was for orientation. That is how sure I was that I was coming here. And I have loved it for all 6 years that I've been here. Other than obviously Virginia Tech, my family, sports have played a big influence in my life. I've been a huge sports fan, again, ever since I can remember. I grew up playing every sport you can imagine, from soccer to baseball to football and lacrosse in high school. I ended up playing rugby here for Virginia Tech in college. And I feel that, as I'll talk about here in a second, even though I didn't know I wanted to be a teacher right off the bat, I feel like I learned, intangible skills that were invaluable to me through sports that I can apply to teaching, such as perseverance, cooperation, leadership skills. Obviously, I'm not the tallest guy, in playing sports like football and rugby. I needed to have that attitude where, you can run at me, man, but I'm gonna take you down. So, having challenges thrown at me left and right, I feel like I really learned from all of that and brought that into the classroom. But in terms of me wanting to be a teacher, I honestly didn't know I wanted to be a teacher until the very end of my junior year of college. The first informational meeting I attended was during my senior year in the fall. I obviously thought I had gotten a late start because everybody's like, freshmen, juniors, or I'm sorry, freshmen, sophomores, a couple juniors, and I'm probably the only senior sitting in there. But when I came here, I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I thought I may have wanted to be a doctor. My dad's a pediatrician, and so I came in, and obviously I got that question after I graduated high school. What do you want to do? And I just immediately told everybody, well, I want to be a doctor. So I went, started off, declared my major early. I was a biology major coming in. Got 6 weeks into it, and I hated it. Everything about it. I hated my teachers, my classes, the information. So after those 6 weeks, I just kind of decided, which is wonderful about college, I took a little sabbatical for a week. I just kind of sat down, gathered my thoughts, tried to figure out what I wanted to do, what I enjoyed learning about. And every time I thought about that, it brought me back to my history and social studies classes in high school and middle school and even before that. So after that, I went in, grabbed my change of major form, changed to history, and never looked back, and it's one of the best decisions I've ever made in my entire life. So now, as a teacher, I am a firm believer in doing social studies. Social studies is something that when it is just taught to children, maybe just lectured at, maybe even add in some activities, it's not the most appealing subject to be learning. Obviously I loved it, but I'm sure everyone here has known kids that have absolutely hated social studies. So in order for me to combat that, I believe that you have to get your students directly involved. Get them engaged in the material so they are actually doing history, maybe through visual discovery or some history alive strategies. But I absolutely bring that to the classroom, and I think that's why, as I'll explain here in a bit, I believe I was successful in my field observation and my internship. Another thing that I base my teaching on is building off of prior knowledge. Prior knowledge is exactly why when you are 5 and 6 years old, you learn how to color in the lines, you know how to spell your name, you know how to do basic math, simple addition, because as you advance in school, it's all building upon that, and I believe social studies is no different. Unfortunately, during my student teaching internship, I was in a 7th grade middle school, and I was teaching the economics part of civics. A lot of my students had never had any formal instruction in civics before, so I basically had to start from scratch. So what I did, for instance in this lesson that I'm going to pull up, I don't know why I keep doing that, but this was the first lesson I ever did with my kids. It was the introductory lesson, and especially with a subject that can be as abstract in nature as economics, I felt that if they could understand the basics of economics, the basic terms and concepts right off the bat, that I could build off of that as I went through my, my internship. So as I scroll down, I had 12 words, you know, things like scarcity, resources, supply and demand, that again, if I felt my students could understand, they would be able to succeed in my classroom. So a couple days later, you know, I drilled this in. I had a nice PowerPoint, which is here, a lot of pictures. I like to relate all my information to things they can relate to. You know, because if you imagine a consumer like Patrick Starr here, if you can see that, you know, he's consuming a hamburger, which is an actual consumption, but he had to buy it first. And I explained that to them using something that they could relate to, a SpongeBob character. And I assessed this, like I said, a few days later, and my students did great. The average on my vocab quiz was a 90%. So obviously that was a good stepping off point. So we're doing a lot of flipping back and forth. Also, in my classroom, I always hated it when teachers did the same thing over and over and over again. They just sat there and lectured. Some of my teachers even just made me take notes out of the book all class. And I felt like in those types of classes, my education suffered because I looked around for things to do, look at a poster, maybe play a game. In one of my classes, I even played poker with 2 of my friends the entire year. Ended up winning $1, by the way. But I mean, I found myself not wanting to learn. And as a teacher, that's unacceptable for me. My students need to learn, you know, whether it's a life skill or the content I'm teaching, I need them to learn something. So I always try to change up my classroom. For instance, here you see I'm working on a concept frame. This is actually the lesson that I did, that I just showed you all with the vocab. A lot of experiential exercises, which I'll go into here in a little while. But changing things up every day, but keeping the basic class structure, for instance, a just do it, then maybe a lecture and an activity and some kind of closure. But varying what happens there in the middle and how I'm actually instructing, it keeps kids on their toes and it made them excited to come to my class. They wanted to come in and learn. They deem me the fun teacher, which I guess can be a good or a bad thing. But, you know, it really showed in the way students succeeded in my classroom. And last but not least, I know we are all here very, not necessarily restricted, but we have to go by certain standards that are provided by the state and country. But I like to go beyond those. For instance, there was one unit where I was focusing on SOL CE 12D, which deals with Virginia in the global economy and how technology affects it and their modern day economy. But it dawned on me that in order for my students to have an understanding of Virginia's economy today, I needed to go back and teach them about how Virginia's economy was, you know, in 1607 and how it's evolved. So I did an entire lesson on the history of Virginia's economics, and I think that greatly improved my students' understanding of, for instance, why Virginia still grows tobacco today, or why in Southwest Virginia, say in Salem, for instance, we don't specialize in shipbuilding. No water around here, but we got a lot of mountains with a lot of natural resources, so it definitely goes into that, and I thought that was great. In terms of my field observation, this is where, you know, obviously I took all those theory classes trying to figure out who I am as a teacher. And during my field observation and just before it is when I really decided who I was going to be, you know, all that I just talked about. And I think my metaphor here that I created sums it up very well. Teaching is a spider's web, a masterpiece created by an architect where everything is well structured with connections and interwoven parts, creating something truly artistic. Teaching very underrated profession. I would rather do nothing else. Nothing else. And it is something truly artistic when you can look at one of your students and you explain something to them and they have what I like to call that aha moment, where they truly understand something. I mean, it just provides a feeling that it's unequivocal to anything else that I've ever felt. But in terms of my field internship, unfortunately, obviously I'm not making my own lesson plans. I had to teach how my cooperating teacher taught. I was working off his lesson plans. And luckily for me, especially going into my student teaching internship the next semester where I'd have kind of my own classroom, I was thrown into the fire very, very early. 2 weeks in, he looked at me, he had to go do something. He was the head football coach at a high school in Roanoke. And he said, "Hey, do you want to teach today?" And me not wanting to be, you know, unconfident, absolutely, sure, let's go. I literally looked over the PowerPoint for about 5 minutes, jumped in there. Can't say it was the best lesson I ever taught, but I got through it, and from that day on, I was teaching every single day until the end of my field observation, which was great. Again, I was doing an 11th grade U.S. history class, and I felt that I related very well to the kids there because of my coaching experience. I used to help out the football team at my old high school, Westfield, before I'd come back during summers, which is another way that I kind of decided I wanted to be a teacher. It's that whole mentor aspect. And during this semester in the fall, every single weekend, I left straight from school on Friday, drove all the way up to Northern Virginia, coached the football games. I was able to stay in touch online, text messages. We had a film website called Huddle. I put in a lot of time along with my field internship or observation. So I'd go home on Friday and teach, and sometimes if Virginia Tech had a home game, I would come right back Friday night into early Saturday morning and get back for it. And I feel like that's something that, another thing I bring to the classroom is that determination and that commitment. You know, I could have the worst student in the world, but I'm going to make sure you're learning something. I'm going to be committed to you succeeding in the classroom. Now, as my history cohort and my professors know, when I got assigned in the spring, 7th graders teaching economics, I was not overly thrilled. I thought about how I was as a 7th grader, and don't get me wrong, I was a good student, I made good grades, but I was not a very teacher-friendly student. I got bored very easily. I would jump up, run around the classroom, try to distract kids. I've thrown things at my teachers before. It was awful. I mean, I was not the best student. And again, something a lot of you may not know, I wasn't very good at economics either. In college, I got a D in microeconomics and a C in macroeconomics. And just thinking about that, I thought this was going to be awful. But it ended up being one of the greatest experiences of my life. I really connected with the kids. They connected with me. The day I left, I had kids crying. A few wrote me cards, wanting me to come back. One girl, I told them not to get me anything. She ends up getting me an iTunes gift card. I mean, it was just such a rewarding feeling, especially having gone into it and not really looking forward to it as much as I thought I was going to. And now in terms of my classroom for my student teaching internship, again, I wanted them to do social studies. I wanted them to be involved in economics. I did this through current events, which that ended up being a later thing that I introduced along with a Band of the Day. I was talking about Bruce Springsteen one day and my students looked at me like I had two heads. So I had to, you know, introduce them to the classics. But more importantly, current events, you know, I try to connect to modern day economics, all the economic problems in Europe right now, austerity measures, stuff like that. A lot of group and individual work, I varied both. I like letting my kids do group work, but there were some days where I had planned to do it and they weren't able to handle themselves. So it was made to individual work. But one of my favorite lessons that I did was when I was talking about production and consumption. Hopefully this pops up again. I was talking about production and consumption and how things are produced and then consumed. So I got kids together in groups, and what they did for me was they created basically a production consumption chain, and there was a nice little guide in the book for it. And they basically needed to tell me how they would be able to sell lemonade, just starting with lemons, where the lemons were produced, who was producing them, who distributed them, how they get them, how they made the lemonade. I don't know why it's jumping there, but All right, for time's sake, we'll get rid of that. I was going to show you pictures of the production consumption chains, but apparently that's not working very well. Again, concept frames, graphically organizing this information for students was key for me. I'm a very visual learner. Students today are extremely visual learners, and if they can organize that stuff visually, I believe it processes mentally far better than if I just sat there and spoke at them and they had to take notes. Another thing that I like to do that is the embodiment of doing social studies is experiential exercises. This lesson is directly from Matt back there. I did a money flow activity to show the circular flow of money. So I took the kids into a big lecture hall. I basically assigned half of them to be consumers and half of them to be producers. They were given money based on who they were or resources based on who they were. And basically, producers had to buy resources from consumers, bring them to me for what was called a product or an econo, and then they would go through and basically whatever consumer ended up with the most money, I'm sorry, the consumer that ended up with the most product and the producer that ended up with the most money at the end, they won a homework pass. So by doing stuff like this, it gets my kids, they'll always remember doing that, I guarantee it, because they were so involved, they were excited about it. For instance, the few questions on the test that I gave after or during this unit, they averaged 95% on questions about circular flow in the economy. So doing stuff like this obviously paid off in big ways for me as a student teacher.